On this episode of China Unscripted, the CCP sees India as a threat. What the CCP fails to understand about India could be its downfall. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
And joining us once again is Cleo Paskal, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Cleo, thanks for joining us once again.
Always a great pleasure. A little bit daunting because this time we're separated by such distance. I'm in northern rural Quebec and you're in southern rural Quebec, so I feel like we're not quite as in sync as usual, but I'll do my best.
Well, you know, anti-communist fervor connects us all, regardless of distance.
It certainly does. It's like that fungi, right? That encompasses the entire planet. I hope, right?
Is that like Avatar?
Yeah.
What?
Isn't that what? That's what the Avatar is about. There's like this tree, soul-devouring tree.
Oh, the blue people Avatar.
Yes.
Okay.
Not the Last Airbender.
I was thinking Star Trek, but I'll go with what you're thinking.
Oh, right. There was something on one of the newer ones about it's like the hyperspace was like bubbles or fungi or something. The new Star Trek is stupid, bad. They're communists.
Well, there is
everything bad communist?
Yes.
I'll talk about China. I will go full in on that. The discussions about Star Trek are a little bit too sensitive for me, so I will leave that one to you. You've got more courage than I do. Yeah.
Yes. Well, it since we're on the sci-fi kick, it reminds me of the movie Interstellar, where Anne Hathaway makes the point that, like, you know, this man she loved went to another planet and was like, you know, in suspended animation over there, you know, 10 million light years away or whatever, but like they were still connected by love. So, you know, through time and space, faster than light. That's the power of love. So I think anti-communist fervor is even more powerful than love. It connects us all, except for the communists.
Well, in fact, it is directly linked to love because communism gives no value to love and tries to destroy the pillars that foster and create the ability to love as families, as communities, as all that sort of stuff. So it is very relevant.
Yes.
I feel like, Cleo, you just definitely saved what Chris was talking about and
No.
turned it into a much more meaningful and poignant thing.
No, it's called a setup and a home run. I don't know.
I think what you're looking for is assist.
Wait,
well, no,
which
'cause you
game are we talking about now?
Or it could be
Hockey,
bowling. Like, you
obviously.
set him up, I'll knock him down.
But that's anyway.
So So moving on. What are we chatting about today? What's our?
I think it's actually India, not Star Trek.
Well, it all ties together because of communism. So communists, they can't feel love. And so the CCP, instead of feeling love for India, feels threatened by India. It's perfect, Shelley.
Well, because fear leads to anger, and anger leads to hate.
We're hitting all the major sci-fi properties. But yes, there
like
is
last week when we spent like 10 minutes talking about.
We cut that.
Yes, I know. This is something people will never see. We spent 10 minutes talking about Battlestar Galactica and then we cut it.
This is baked into the intro of our show, so we can't get rid of it.
How did we already go off the rails? We haven't even got to the first question yet.
You seem upset. Is it because you love too much? That's why I like you, Shelley. You're not a communist. The CCP feels threatened by India, that India somehow undermines its legitimacy. What is the threat?
Well, India is everything the CCP says isn't possible. It's a country of over 1 billion people that is run democratically. I mean, it's got ups and downs, but it's definitely democratic. And it has a growing economy. In fact, its economy is arguably doing better than the Chinese economy. It's a pluralistic society. It doesn't throw 1 million of its own ethnic and religious minorities in jail for the sake of domestic stability. It partners in relatively equitable ways with its neighbors. It has a relatively free press. All those things that Chinese Communist Party says is impossible if you want to govern such a large country and have economic growth. Right next door, you've got this living, breathing, thriving example of why that is completely wrong. And so it strikes right at the heart of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And it actually does go back to this issue. I mean, love in its many forms is, the things that underpin an individual Indian's identity will be, in many cases, family. And of course, we know that the Chinese Communist Party tried to destroy the family through the one-child policy, and faith. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party is threatened by adherence to anything except the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party, and freedom, which of course is also anathema to the Chinese Communist Party. So you've got this. India's obviously not perfect. Nothing involving humans is, but you have this much more human enabling society that's doing okay, right next door to this repressive, autocratic, dictatorial, very brittle, unhealthy society and governance system. So it doesn't make China look very good. It is very much humanity, love in the form of that kind of humanity versus a machine autocratic system, and you can see which one works better.
Well, I'm confused about something you said, Cleo. You said that China justifies its authoritarianism by saying, like, this is what's necessary to govern this many people to have economic growth. But I was told that if we give money to China and help their economy grow, that will make them less authoritarian.
Right. Yes. That was what people who, in some cases, were making money off of China were very convinced about, because it was working for a very small group of Americans, but it was certainly not working for the majority of Americans and others in the West. And it demonstrably didn't contribute to any form of loosening up in China. And actually, it was an Indian who explained this to me probably about 15 years ago, by saying that the Chinese economic model is built on market manipulation and repression. There is no way that it can continue to grow economically if it democratizes, because then you would get workers who wanted to be paid properly, and people who didn't want huge environmental damage in their villages, and all of the sort of things that add cost to production if you're doing it in a normal way like you would in the rest of the world. So in order to be able to continue to have those economic advantages in the international marketplace, it had to continue with that repressive system and manipulative system, which included intellectual property theft and all those other sorts of things. So it was never really an option. It was never going to grow, become democratic, and continue its economic growth, because its economic growth was dependent on so many on the zeroing out of, or considering externalities, economic externalities, things that everybody else in the world has to incorporate into their economic costs. Or any normal country does. It kind of got around it a little bit when it was allowed to join the WTO and fake normalize its economy. But the democratization process wasn't congruent with with the kind of economic growth path. So the internal logic of it didn't make sense. And that was sort of when I started to realize that, and a few other things, how far advanced Indian analysis was on understanding how China operates, because they basically had similar histories, in terms of colonization, things like that, and had chosen a different path, so they could recognize it much more easily, and why they weren't doing that, and how come they couldn't compete with China in certain areas, that sort of a thing. And of course, they weren't. India wasn't originally a neighbor with China. There was this buffer state of Tibet, and they watched China eat Tibet and become a neighbor of India from 1950 on. And so there was no mythologizing, sort of this thing about China not being expansionist. The Indians certainly knew that wasn't the case either. So a lot of these fallacies that we allowed to permeate Western discussions about China didn't really take hold within India, and it allowed them to see much more clearly what was going on within China and the operations of the Chinese Communist Party at home and abroad very early on.
So is this why these American investors were not raising the flag of investing in India? Because they knew that with India being a democracy, they couldn't make the kind of profit that they could make in China as long as they allow for horrible human rights atrocities.
Well, India also, and Indians will tell you, was a real mess for a very long time, in part economically, in part through kind of failed left-wing Western academic economic models being tested out in India. So, it was a real mess. And at the same time, there was an enormous amount of corruption. So I was going back through some of the early coverage that I did about India, again, like 15, 20 years ago. And the depth of the scandals, like the Commonwealth Games scandals or the 2G spectrum scandals, gives you an idea of how long ago this was costing the Indian economy billions of dollars. So it took, there was also a degree of dysfunction that the court cases in India could last generations, literally. There were a lot of other factors that made India a difficult place to invest. Land ownership issues. Each state was a little bit different. And that's slowly been cleared up, not completely, but certainly much better than it was before. So India had its own challenges, some of them as a result of Nehruvian economics, which didn't work. But it inherited, when India became independent in 1947, it was not one country. There was sort of the remnants of British India, and then there were over 500 princely states with varying degrees of autonomy. And there was Pakistan, which at that time consisted of West Pakistan, which is what is now Pakistan, and East Pakistan, which is what is now Bangladesh, not connected. They were kind of on either sides of India. And there was this partition where you had millions of people moving from, mostly Muslims, moving from India in a panic on trains to Pakistan, and the same with Hindus moving in the other direction. And then within 3 years, you had the Korean War and of course, what happened with Tibet, and then later on, you had Bangladesh in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, going through an independence movement, becoming independent. And then you had, it's just been churning and churning from its inception. And in 1962, China invaded or, hit the border and pushed in through the border. So there's been a lot. It hasn't been an easy, slow process for the Indian state to coalesce, find its footing, and create a society and economy that is truly its own. It's been shedding a lot of these structures that were. It still has laws on the books that are basically British colonial laws that give the administration a lot of power. If an Indian government official, especially say 10, 15 years ago, wanted to get you for whatever reason, there were volumes of laws that they could use to get you. And then you'd have to pay a bribe or you'd end up tied up in court forever. And a lot of them were leftover British colonial laws. That's slowly being cleared away. And as that happens, and certain states are moving quicker than others, it becomes a much better place to do business. Obviously, much better place to live and just be a human being, as mentioned at the beginning. But in terms of competition for supply chain redirection, it makes a lot more sense now than it would before. So right at the time when we're seeing the weaknesses in the Chinese Communist Party system, this fragility, the collapse of the real estate market, the debt issues, you're starting to see the innate strengths of the Indians themselves, who are regaining control over their own systems, creating this competitive economy that is much more viable.
Well, as long as we're busting some myths, there's one that says that India and China should be cooperating. They both dealt with colonialism. They're both developing countries, but that fails to understand. That fails to understand what you've called comprehensive national power. Can you tell us a little bit about that and just how this affects how China treats India?
Sure. So that's my version of intellectual property theft. I didn't invent the term. I stole it from the Chinese Communist Party think tanks. They use this term, comprehensive national power, to rank countries. I mean, when you talk about it, it sounds crazy, but a lot of things that happen in the Chinese Communist Party system sound crazy. But this is a big one. So they have this system where each country is ascribed a numerical value, and for its comprehensive national power. And the goal is obviously for the Chinese state to be number one in the world in terms of comprehensive national power. Now, when we think about national power, the typical things that you would include would be, economic power, GDP, military, those sorts of things. The Chinese Communist Party way of doing it can vary by think tank, and it is opaque. But we know that it includes things that we wouldn't consider part of our national power. So, for example, if you're looking at a place like Solomon Islands, if you have very good intel files and have bought off half of the leadership, that goes towards China's comprehensive national power and detracts from Solomon Islands' national power. Similarly, you might have lithium in your country, but if it's being extracted by a Chinese company, that goes to China's comprehensive national power. And of course, Chinese companies and Chinese individuals are, because of the 2017 National Intelligence Law, compelled to support the Chinese state. So that is a way of expanding comprehensive national power through Chinese individuals, often by coercion, and Chinese companies. So they have this very comprehensive way of looking at power and power projection, and it's incredibly important. And if you look at comprehensive national power, it's a relative metric. So you can the standard way that we think about a competition is, you try to win. But if you're China, you can lose, but if the other guy loses even more, you're still winning. So that's that relative component of it makes it so that it's not just a zero-sum game. It can actually be a negative game as long as the other guy loses more. And that's a kind of very important thing to understand. And it explains, for example, I think personally, what you saw around COVID. So whatever happened with COVID, they realized they had a problem, and they blocked internal flights, but pushed for external flights. And we've had it from President Panuelo, for example, who's one of the few world leaders who's willing to go on record of the Federated States of Micronesia. But the pressure that the Chinese were pushing were to keep international flights from China going, even though internal flights out of Wuhan were being blocked. So that makes sense in a comprehensive national power mindset where you're going to get hit, your economy is going to hurt. So what do? You try to make sure everybody else is hurt also. And in that buffer time zone, you try to position yourself so that you can, corner the market on PPE, or you can, do whatever you need to do to ensure that your comprehensive national power is hurt less than everybody else's. So that's and of course fentanyl is another big one. The way that it's killing, Chinese linked fentanyl is killing minimum 70, 80,000 Americans a year. Every American who dies, that's an entire family that's destroyed. That is a huge detrimental effect on communities and societies. And at families at the individual level, and that hurts the U.S.'s comprehensive national power. But in a relative sense, it helps the Chinese. So for me, I found it a very helpful way of understanding how the Chinese Communist Party can do things that I, as a just normal human being, find unthinkable.
There's a reason why I don't like communists.
So is this a communist thing, or is this kind of like a CCP thing, the comprehensive national power metric?
So as far, I don't know. It's a good question. It's a good question. I think that, and again, I don't, if it would be communist or authoritarian or dictatorships generally. I don't know. This is embedded in a way that in the system that can really only be effective. Like I don't know whether Iran thinks the same way. Like I'm trying to think of other countries that will damage other enemy countries to such a degree. And you've got the kind of usual thing that you'd have with Russian disinformation campaigns or things like that, or things. But the stuff that the Chinese Communist Party is doing, I've never seen before. What do you think?
Well, I'm thinking of some of the Soviet infiltration into American culture, going back to like the 60s, maybe even earlier, but to kind of demoralize America and disrupt academia, disrupt the traditional family structure. There was certainly some Soviet influence in that because, they had written about it, but that I don't know. I don't know to what degree that was the Soviet Union pushing everything, but that does seem like a kind of, lose-lose situation, right?
Yeah, well, I think so. That goes to this what's been called disintegration warfare or entropic warfare, right? Which is one of the tools of political warfare, or you can use political warfare to achieve entropic warfare gains, which is where you weaken the other country, you lower their comprehensive national power by creating a state of entropy or disintegration, fragmentation within the target state. So yes, that's definitely the Soviets did it. And in fact, I think that you see a lot of overlap between Soviet operations and Chinese Communist Party operations. And it's not incidental because the Soviets helped the Chinese Communist Party set up a lot of those systems at the beginning. And I think there's probably quite a bit of, in certain locations, cooperation between them on intelligence operations. So that would kind of make sense. And North Korea as well. I mean, you saw, for example, with Zimbabwe, North Korea helped Mugabe at the beginning, and then China kind of started to take over more. So that specific aspect of comprehensive national power, this sort of entropic warfare, this targeting, it is congruent with trying to achieve Communist Party goals, of course, which is to reshape all of society from the ground up. So that makes sense to me. I don't know.
All right. So given that China's comprehensive national power is inherently relative, that is, it's okay if the other guy loses, and that in no case is China going to help another country increase its own comprehensive national power more than what China does. So it's always, no matter what kind of deal you have with China, their view is always that they have to win more than you,
or lose less than you.
Yeah, or lose less. So then, India understands this. They, especially in 2020, started to break away from China in a lot of ways after that border clash. So what happened with that?
Okay. Yeah. So again, one of the first places I saw this comprehensive national power stuff written about was, I saw it in a book by a Chinese New Zealand academic talking specifically about the Pacific Islands in 2010. But the Indians themselves, some people in the Indian military wrote about this in 2013. So they're very aware of this issue. And but there had been the Chinese Communist Party is very good at elite capture and influence operations, and it's not necessarily directly through them. There's often we think in bilateral terms, especially if you're in the U.S. You kind of think it's always the U.S. and somebody else, but there's often another player involved, and there are very few actual bilateral relationships anymore. So if you're dealing with, if the U.S. is dealing with the Solomon Islands, the Chinese are in the room somehow. And similarly, the Indians are very aware that, that the Chinese are just floating all around them. They've got this Iron Brotherhood partnership with Pakistan. But there was a bit of a paralysis in the strategic community due to some elite capture, and there were a lot of other influences involved that didn't necessarily want India to go straight up against China, so to speak. But like you said, the Galwan attack in 2020, which killed 20 Indian soldiers, broke the dam. So all of those members of the defense strategic community in India who had been worried about China since 1962 suddenly got to say, we have a plan for this. And all of these initiatives started to come forward. Within 2 weeks of the Galwan attack, they banned 59 Chinese apps, including TikTok and WeChat. Just banned them. That was it. No prolonged thing like you got in the US. It just was done. They also started to block FDI. They've just recently blocked, there was a Chinese attempt to set up a big EV battery plant in India. They blocked that investment. They went after Xiaomi phone manufacturer for money laundering. They seized like $700 million. They just really did all of the things that we should all be doing in many aspects of dealing directly with Chinese infiltration. They talk about China as a threat publicly in the media. There was just an article that came out in one of their defense magazines, CLAWS, the Center for, I think, Land Warfare Studies, which is basically the Army think tank, talking about rethinking Tibet. And, that's now being publicly discussed, this issue of Tibet. And, perhaps the liberation of this captured territory. So some talk about the ASEAN Sea instead of the South China Sea. So once the dam broke, you started to see this really comprehensive national defense approach to dealing with China. And that's bilateral, but it also started to bring in others. And this is this thing about it's not just bilateral anymore. There's always these other elements. And what China hates is when countries come together. And India started to really do some interesting things, like I2U2, which is the India, Israel, United States, UAE partnership, which is bringing together a whole new constellation that does not include China, doesn't include Russia, and gives a way of interacting on things like tech, which is kind of very interesting. At the G20, which India led, you had the proposal for this India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, right? So not only is India going after protecting itself from China head on, but it's also broadening itself out. It's just the Prime Minister of Vietnam was just in India for the first that level visit in 10 years. They signed a defense agreement. India has sold BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. It's working with Taiwan, not publicly discussed very much, but it is very active. It's trying to give Sri Lanka the economic wherewithal to extract itself from Chinese influence. So since the Galwan incident, or Galwan attack, you can see from India all of the different ways that we actually can fight back against China. There's no country, I'd argue, no country on the planet that has been fighting China in this comprehensive national defense way, and including multinational defense way, as much as India has been.
Well, despite everything the Indian government has done vis-a-vis China, the trade between India and China continues to go up.
Yeah, it does. But they're keeping China out of critical sectors. So before Galwan, for example, China had targeted Indian startup companies and was particularly going after kind of critical software developers and things like that. A lot of that's been sort of more blocked off. You've heard about just recently, there was discussion about reopening trade with China. From what I understand, that's to give more visas to Chinese technicians to come into India to work on Indian-owned machines that are Chinese manufacture. So it's fairly contained. It's fairly specific and fairly contained. It's not a countries. These are very complex countries and very complex environments. Their policies can't look like ours. They have they do share a border with China. They're not confrontational in the way that they don't issue press releases saying we hate you. They do things that protect themselves and block off access and possibly hurt the other person without announcing it, but the other party knows. So it's not going to. It can't look like what our systems look like. The U.S. has had this luxury of at least thinking it's fairly isolated since the beginning. George Washington wrote at the beginning about the U.S.'s detached and distant situation. Forgetting that the British were right above him, and then there was Mexico, and of course the whole west of the country didn't quite exist yet. But the idea was, unlike the European countries, they're not surrounded by competitors on a consistent level. I mean, of course, and forgetting, of course, the First Nations. But that's this idea, and out of that idea came this perception of isolationism. That basically U.S. foreign policy has vacillated between isolationist or not. But the idea was always isolationism was an option. Isolationism isn't an option for India that has Pakistan on the border, Bangladesh on the border, China on the border, all that stuff. It's not going to look like that. And in fact, Grant Newsham, who you've had on the show, testified before Congress recently that isolationism isn't an option for the U.S. anymore either, because the way that China operates has erased distance. There's this erasure of distance through cyber warfare, through chemical warfare like fentanyl, through biological warfare like COVID, that has made it so that the U.S. is no longer in a detached and distant situation. The attacks are on the homeland now. But regardless, the foreign policy community in the U.S. still tends to have at least an element of isolationism in their mentality. And so you can't superimpose that over an understanding of how India operates.
Yeah, there was speaking of the trade thing, there was this article in The Economist that came out last month it was kind of about whether the bust up between India and China is ending. And a lot of it was based on the idea that India is reliant on Chinese technology, and it was kind of positing this as India is going to have to balance what its military chiefs want, which is a more hawkish position on China, versus what its business leaders want, which is more trade with China and more I guess Chinese tech and things like that. Do you think this is true, or is this is this analysis like a misreading, using kind of that same, essentially, like you can make the same argument about Western countries, right? Like the idea that, well, does Germany want more Chinese automobiles, or does the U.S. need more Chinese whatever trade goods versus like a hawkish stance? So is it just superimposing this like Western framework on what's happening with India, or what's going on there?
So two things. The first thing is, again, to understand that India operates completely differently. Indians, you can't have dual citizenship if you're an Indian. So it's not like even like a China, where you've got one foot out the door if you're an Indian entrepreneur, if you're running a major company. You need to be Indian to sort of buy land and do certain other things, and you can't be Indian and something else. So their operating environment as individual business leaders is very different. But you have Chinese influence operations, and this issue about a third or fourth country always being involved. You'd think that it would be Chinese operatives who want to break up the India-U.S. relationship, which they do. But so do the French. The French want to be the ones to sell the weapons to India, and the nuclear power plants and stuff to India, and things like that. So there are other countries that you might even think of as allies who want to create friction within the relationship. But the second thing, which kind of takes us in a different direction, but I think is relevant because it's something that you've experienced also, is the way that the media treats India, the Western media treats India. And if you mention The Economist in India, you'll get looks of absolute disdain. Same thing with the New York Times and various other what many people would consider totemic Western media houses. The perception within India is that they have an agenda, and part of the agenda is to denigrate India and to isolate it and to make it look less attractive to Western investors. And apart from other things, and including going after it socially and things like that. And they'll reference, for example, there was a New York Times advertisement for an India correspondent, which apparently said something along the lines of, must be willing to attack the Modi government for its bad policies or something. It was kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm giving you the perception of what it's like on the ground. But this extends to social media. So there was a, I think the hashtag was "What's wrong with India." Somebody put out some tweet about something went wrong in India and hashtagged it "What's wrong with India." You're gonna have to check and make sure that's what it was, but I think it was something along those lines, and it went viral. And the Indian Twitter sphere or exosphere said this makes no sense. This doesn't make sense that this tweet would get picked up so much. So they started testing that hashtag with kind of putting up pictures of like homeless people in San Francisco, but putting that "What's wrong with India" hashtag to it. And those went viral as well. Those were also being amplified. So they were trying to show that there was something in the algorithm that was anti-India. And you'll get cases of, there's a very good podcaster called Adi, who does Adi Def Talks, and YouTube will consistently knock down his viewership and make it look like he doesn't have people watching, things like that. So anytime that we're getting coverage about India through our normal venues of information, which we may not trust on other topics. We know not to trust them on other topics. But where else are you going to be getting news about India unless you're going to the Sunday Guardian, for which I happen to write, but which happens to be a very good Indian newspaper, or many of the other Indian newspapers or television channels. We get this perhaps biased or some sort of view about India, which may not be complete, to be polite. But you've experienced this sort of thing also. So what do you think about this?
Well, I was going to ask, where does this condensation towards India come from?
It would be a hot front meeting a cold front. I think that's where condensation usually
I know.
comes from.
What is can you
condescension?
Make that condescension? What did I say?
Condensation.
So where does this condensation come from? Like, I just have a glass. There's something in there. It's liquid in there, and then liquid comes on the outside, but it doesn't drain. Explain that to me.
Because India is so hot, and we're so cool on India that you end up with this condensation. I think it plays into it rides along on a bunch of different trends. First of all, obviously, there is a huge Chinese vested interest in trying to make India look dysfunctional or more, so that you don't get redirection of supply chains, so that its legitimacy, the legitimacy of the CCP isn't questioned, all that sort of stuff. There's similarly jihadist elements, that China-Pakistan force for evil, which has a lot of leverage in the business community and also within Washington, rides along together. So these, the campus protesters that you currently would see sort of stating pro-Hamas slogans could very easily be redeployed in a short time, likely, for an anti-India demonstration, for example. So
has that happened? I don't remember massive anti-India protests.
They'll come. I mean, unless this is sort of, but you're starting to see it come to be primed. And if you look at sort of the jihadist literature, obviously you've got the big Satan, which is the U.S., and the little Satan, which is Israel. But India is right up there. India is a major target. And you see it around disinformation. Like India passed this Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA, which was presented as being an anti-Muslim, anti-human rights thing. But what it did was it if you were a refugee in India that came from one of the neighboring Muslim majority countries, and you were Christian or Buddhist or Hindu, one of the minority religions, it would fast track you, which gives you an idea of how fast the Indian bureaucracy works, because it dated back to, I think, 2010 or something. But it would fast track you for citizenship if you were a persecuted religious minority from a Muslim majority country. In the US media, that somehow got spun into being an anti-Muslim piece of legislation. Now, I think one of the arguments was it didn't include Ahmadi Muslims, and there's a legitimate case for having included them because, of course, they're being persecuted in Pakistan. But it was actually a human rights. It was giving citizenship to persecuted minorities. But it got spun to the point where people who I know, who I have a lot of respect for in DC, because there's such a narrow track of information about India and there is so little information about India, that what got injected into that track was, this is discriminatory. This is a Hindu nationalist discriminatory piece of legislation. It wasn't said, for example, some of the people I was speaking to care about Christian persecution of Christians, but they themselves didn't know that it protected Christian refugees who were coming from Pakistan and Bangladesh and elsewhere.
Are you saying that there is this pro-China, pro-jihadi force influencing American media? I'm shocked.
Yes, that's right. Round up the usual suspects and
I do remember, that whole Hindu nationalism, like that. There was like a period of time when there was a lot of criticism in the media about Modi and like the rise of Hindu nationalism in India, essentially.
Yeah,
I think I saw some comparisons to Hitler. If you can imagine that somebody would compare someone they didn't like to Hitler.
On the internet?
On the internet, Matt.
Wow.
First of all, I don't see anything wrong with either of those two words, either Hindu or nationalist, right? So I'm not sure, but by putting them together and in that context, there is an attempt to make a mental association to making both of those things sound bad, right? So we'll start with there. We'll start with kind of the psychological warfare component of it, where you're now, just by saying that, suddenly you're thinking Hindus are bad. Like and caring about your country, being a nationalist is bad. What often happens when I have discussions with people about this, and there have been some very terrible incidents. There have been priests who was attacked or caste based atrocities, but my metric is, do we know about it? If we know about it, first of all, that's a good thing, because there are a million atrocities like that in China that we don't get to hear about. Second of all, are we hearing about it in the context of court proceedings? Are the perpetrators being brought to account? Because if they are, then something terrible happened in a country of 1.4 billion people. Think terrible things are going to happen. But is the system trying to correct that? Is there a societal acknowledgement that this is a wrong thing to do, which, I mean, implicitly there is, because there's getting to be coverage about it. If it was normalized, there wouldn't be coverage about it. And then is there an attempt to prosecute the people who perpetrated the violent act, in which case the system is trying to say that this is a bad thing and you'll be punished if you do this. So in most cases, that's the situation. We heard, I mean, if you remember, for a while, it was all about rape. If you walked, there were some horrific gang rapes in India, and huge demonstrations about it, which is very healthy. And then the perpetrators were prosecuted, and in most cases, the high-profile ones went to jail. That's a normal progression in a democratic country with rule of law. But that's not often the message that's portrayed. It's just, these terrible things are happening against identifiable minorities or against women, and so the entire country needs to be written off.
When I did a quick search for that, what's wrong with India hashtag, a lot of it was gang rape stuff.
Yeah. And but then the question is, were those then prosecuted? But it's interesting that you got the bad stuff, because when Indian Twitter first got a hold of it, they started putting out good things about India with the hashtag "What's wrong with India," right? They started showing schools and new. I mean, it's a country that it's in develop. It was left broke and broken by the British in 47. And it has been trying to rebuild itself. So the question is, are literacy rates going up? Is life expectancy going up? Like, what is the trend line since 47? And is it going in the right direction? You can't expect it to go from, China uses a century of humiliation as an excuse for everything. India had 4 centuries of humiliation. And it's not using it as an excuse. It's getting on with trying to reconstruct a country that is viable and can deliver to, as they say, the last person in line. And is it moving in that direction? And according to the metrics, it is. India is not perfect, and it doesn't make all of the geopolitical decisions that somebody from the luxury of DC wishes it would make. It has its relationship with Russia, for example. It has its relationship with Iran. These are not ideal, and the Indians know it's not ideal. But these are decisions that it's making as an independent country. But at the same time, what it's seeing as it's being criticized for those sorts of things is the U.S. Creating a lot of mini-lateral relationships in the Indo-Pacific that aren't including India. So you have this U.S., Japan, South Korea deal that's coming together. There's been no high-level Quad visit. President Biden was supposed to visit India earlier on in the year, which would have then become a high-level Quad visit. He didn't. We now know it could possibly have been because of health reasons. But the result is that, the Quad without high-level leadership has been drifting. But we can see that there's been a prioritization from State Department and Defense of building up these other mini-lateral relationships that aren't including India, like AUKUS, things like that. So India feels very much on its own, and it has to operate in this complex environment where it is a democracy and where it's under attack by a lot of very motivated, well-funded, intelligent opponents, if not, deathly enemies.
Well, what about Indian American Kamala Harris?
Yes, who went to high school in Montreal, by the way.
Really?
She did. Yeah,
it attracts all of the best and brightest.
Yeah, who then leave as quickly as they can. But I didn't say that. Yes, they don't. The Indian strategic community is. It looks at actions. So it looks at. Do they think that Harris administration is going to be good for India? They're not romantic about that kind of stuff. And, if it's a continuation of the Biden administration, they're not very hopeful.
So you had written recently in an Indian policy publication that the Chinese strategic community consistently underestimates India. What does the CCP most underestimate? Can you say most underestimate?
I don't want to be condensation about this, Matt, but
the funny part is Shelley just literally spit while she was laughing.
I wasn't even drinking anything.
Anderson, zoom in on that. Slow-mo. Repeat it. Enhance.
Oh, God.
Seriously, Anderson, do that.
I underestimated Shelley's ability to do a spit take. What does China underestimate about India?
I think actually what you underestimated was Chris's ability to be funny.
Well,
I'm like the
overestimating
Montreal
my
of
own
humor.
ability.
Yes, Chris is the Montreal of humor. Okay. Anyway, back to what was the question?
CCP strategically
Oh,
underestimating
estimates.
India.
Yes.
Yeah. So the CCP. I look it's. I don't think it's a secret that the Chinese Communist Party they are pretty racist, and they're the condescension. Sorry.
What is the matter, Shelley?
Sorry. I was just thinking about the condensation.
You're
And
not.
then Cleo said condescension again, so I just lost it.
I was paying attention to our guest, Shelley. This is unprofessional.
I know.
I don't mean to
What
sound condensation to you, but come on.
what do you have in your cups?
Bourbon. Mao Tai.
Ugh.
That's why the Matt noticed the spit take it burned.
Cleo.
So condensation. No, what's the word?
Condescension.
Condensation.
We're almost there. Sorry, Cleo.
Yeah.
I don't know why you keep coming on our show, but thank you.
When China condensatiates at India.
Mhm.
Why?
Yes. Well, so you keep getting these references always to that 1999 book Unrestricted Warfare, written by two PLA Air Force colonels. And if you are like me and try to pretend you're intelligent by sitting in front of books, then what you do is you go to you got a book up there.
We have a picture of a newspaper.
A
We're
picture of
smart.
then you look at their footnotes and you see who they're referencing. And Unrestricted Warfare references all of the Western strategic texts that you'd imagine, Clausewitz and whatever, and Machiavelli, and the Chinese strategic texts, and not a single Indian strategic text. And India has thousands of years of strategic thought, I mean, including the Arthashastra by Kautilya, very complex strategic history of thought. And they had very wealthy princely states that were coastal and traded internationally. And so, of course, they developed complex geopolitical views and ways of interacting, which are completely missing from Unrestricted Warfare. And part of it is, I think they're just racist. I think they just didn't think that there was, anybody. They just saw the West as being a competitor, but they didn't see India as potentially being an intellectual equal or competitor, which is kind of ironic because, of course, some of Chinese culture came, from India, especially around Buddhism and things like that. But what that does is, and I think that it probably played into what happened in Galwan, because what happened in Galwan was this border clash that Matt talked about, where the Chinese troops attacked an Indian patrol and killed the commanding officer. And I think it's likely they thought, you kill the commanding officer, the Indians will run, because that maybe they were projecting. Maybe that's what would happen in a Chinese unit, in a PLA unit. But what happens on the Indian side is that relationship with the commanding officer is almost like a parent to the children. There's incredible devotion, and they regroup and counterattack with absolute ferocity and dedication and intelligence and training. Estimates are they killed probably at least twice as many PLA. Although the PLA never announced the full number of the dead, which gives you a good idea of how validating it is to be a member of the PLA, because your death is just an embarrassment to your government. Whereas on the Indian side, every one of those 20 who died was commemorated. People knew, people cared, that sort of thing. So I think that they just have underestimated the depth of complexity, intelligence, grit, and focus within the Indian military and the Indian strategic community. And at the same time, the Indian military since Galwan has been completely redesigning itself. So they've changed their conscription way that they bring people in, so that now people are brought in for 4 years, and then after 4 years, 75% of them will leave the force. They get a lump sum of money. There's no pension or anything, but you get a lump sum of money, and then you can go back to school or set up a business. But also there are reservations being set aside, for example, in some police forces, to hire from those people who've just spent 4 years in the military because they're pre-trained, and only 25% will continue on to go to sort of rise up through the ranks. So what the Indians are doing is creating a much more broad coterie of people across Indian society who have served at a national level, worked with Indians from all across the country, and know how to work in a military environment, how to handle weapons, how to take command, how to give command, all that sort of stuff. So, and at the same time, they're also restructuring their theaters of operations, which is a whole other way of becoming better at fighting China. So China, first of all, if you look back to 1999, didn't even consider India a strategic threat. And when it clearly was, I mean, it's held off Pakistan since 1947. But not only was India good, it's redesigning itself to get even better. And I'm not sure the Chinese Communist Party or the PLA really knows how to even understand what's in the heart of an Indian member of the military. Their devotion to country and community, built up from their devotion to family, gives them a level of commitment that may not be there in the average PLA soldier or Marine or member of the Navy or whatever.
So what is in the Arthashastra that makes it so powerful and influential?
So Sun Tzu, The Art of War is like this big, right? I mean, if you boil it down, it's about this big. Arthashastra is like this big. And
size doesn't matter.
You can keep telling yourself that. That's okay. We're with you. That's fine. But
it's how you use the strategic knowledge.
Okay, let's just move on. Let's move on.
We have a guest, Chris. Cleo, please.
My mostly male audience would like my point on the record.
Yes. So the title translates sort of more as the kind of art of life as a whole, and it is actually kind of comprehensive national power manual. So whereas The Art of War is more kind of tactical, even this includes things like the whole thing about your enemy's enemy is your friend. That comes from the Arthashastra, but in the Arthashastra, it continues. It's like your enemy's enemy is your friend. Like there's a whole kind of Mandela of interlinked relationships that's portrayed in it. It also has things like who makes a good spy. So, for example, beggars or doctors or old ladies. I mean, it sort of it anticipates Miss Marple by about 2,000 years. It has an understanding of human interaction, society. It also has this quite useful line, which is a counter to the way the Chinese Communist Party looks at things, which is in Sun Tzu, you have, I can't remember the exact wording, but there's something along the lines of a weak state. A strong people means a weak state. And so the goal of a strong state is to weaken the people, something along those lines. In the Arthashastra, it's a dissatisfied population is more likely to rebel or go to the enemy. So you're better off trying to maintain sort of a certain level of satisfaction within the population. right? Very, very different approaches to the relationship between state and people. And of course, the most relevant aspect of it is it has a whole section on how to care for your war elephants. So that can never be underestimated.
And what are India's modern war elephant equivalent?
I think actually probably cyber capabilities, because that's what gets you over the mountains, right? And gets you to hit the other side in a way that can actually do some damage. But and they're very good at it. But they have a problem, which is that they're so good at it, other countries keep coming and poaching their cyber experts. So I was on a call, like a conference. We did an online conference about cybersecurity in India, and one of the big complaints on the Indian side was that the Israelis keep coming and poaching their cyber experts, which gives you an idea of how good they are.
Oh, I mean, I was going to say that your description of India kind of reminded me of Israel in some ways, of essentially being surrounded by enemies, and also kind of Taiwan in that, like, there's like a very large enemy surrounding them.
Yes,
well.
and
Yeah.
that's right. And there are actually many similarities, but that's something that's also is acknowledged within India, and there is quiet, but if you look for it, you'll see it. Indian engagement and concern and participation with Taiwan. There was a visit not that long ago of 3 retired branch chiefs, military chiefs from India going to Taiwan, former heads of the Navy, Air Force, and Army. You remember that the signaling in the Indo-Pacific region looks different than our signaling. That in that context, that is a very loud signal. They might be former, but they're not really going to be detached from their own systems, especially if all 3 of them are going together at once, right? So there's that sort of thing, and partially it's because there's India knows that fake map that the Chinese Communist Party keeps pushing around includes Taiwan, but it also includes parts of India. And if it does manage to get Taiwan, then what's next on the menu? What other parts of the world is it going to try to eat up? And it becomes, if China invades and eats Taiwan, that's a huge problem, obviously, for the U.S. and U.S. credibility and ability to operate in the Indo-Pacific. It's a huge problem for Japan, for the Philippines. But the U.S. would probably be tied up in that part of the Pacific, and India might be on its own in dealing with a similar push along the border with China, or the border with Tibet, as they like to increasingly call it now. So they're not. We might think, you think, oh, they're really far apart. India is really far from the Pacific theater, is far from Taiwan, but Taiwan is, a maritime border state with China, and India is a border state with China. So China, is what links those 2 together geographically, also in terms of risk, in terms of expansion, in terms of threat, all that sort of stuff. And the Indian strategic community is very aware of that.
So how likely do you think a kinetic war between China and India would be?
It's always this question of, what do you mean? Because there has been kinetic war. They did it in 1962. They tried to do it in Galwan. They're pushing consistently on the border. Is it 20 deaths? Is it 200 deaths? Is it 2,000 deaths? What do you mean when you talk about a kinetic war? Is it using Maoist proxies, which they're doing within India, who are killing people? Is it using jihadist proxies within India to kill people? There's China operates along this warfare continuum, which has political warfare to kinetic, but it, to my mind, where it is along the continuum is largely a subset of what it thinks is going to work with the lowest blowback to China. So there's no moral or legal constraints, I think, on the assessments of when to shift from one to the other from the Chinese side. And they are willing to kill people to achieve goals. I mean, India had a very odd, localized breakout of a specific subset of COVID, and the Chinese would not give the sort of medical support equipment that others were trying to buy for India, but were coming from China, would have to come from China. And China was restricting the export of those life-saving materials. That resulted in deaths, apart from everything else related to the virus itself. So, do you want to call that kinetic warfare? When if they had if they had dropped a biological weapon in Mumbai, would you call that kinetic warfare? If they allow you to die of a Chinese origin virus in Mumbai by withholding treatment, is that kinetic warfare? So China benefits from us having this very binary view of what's kinetic and what's not. And I would argue the death of 70, 80,000 Americans a year from fentanyl is kinetic warfare, right? But I'm potentially in a minority on that one. But I think probably a lot of those families would agree.
Very well said.
So great. We're already completely at war with China. We just don't know it.
Yeah, I think probably every 2 out of 3 of your guests says it.
And we say it too.
It's what else do you want? I mean, if you walk around, again, this is something Grant Newsham has in his book, right? He starts off with a scene in Baltimore where Baltimore looks like it's been hit by an attack. It's you've got zombified people walking the street, devastated industries, industrial sectors. You've got paramedics who are basically war paramedics. They're dealing with dying people, people who are being killed by chemical warfare on a daily basis. This entropic domestic warfare is evident, and in fact, it's one of the reasons why, and this isn't to get political, it's just kind of an observation, that J.D. Vance did so well as a politician because Hillbilly Elegy talks about both the effect of opioid addiction on individuals and the deindustrialization of the U.S., both of which are caused by China, and both of which he says are caused by China. So you can see the average American, if you talk to them about what's going on in their communities, will tell you that many of them, not all of them, but the ones that that voted J.D. Vance into office, in Ohio, for example, will tell you that they're on the receiving end of effectively warfare from the Chinese Communist Party, enabled with proxies in the U.S. enabling that attack.
Sometimes even within our own government and media.
Sometimes.
You're Canadian, so you can talk about these things.
Oh, could I ever? But that, I think, is a whole other show.
The big takeaway I got from this today is, as you said, India has made mistakes, but they've grown so much, they're able to do so much because they've learned from their mistakes. So we should avoid condensation.
Almost. Very close.
Yeah, and also
I knew you were going back to the condensation thing, but I wasn't sure.
Condensation. We should avoid condensation.
Yeah, there's an extra N in there. Another option is that's what happens when you go from a Cold War to a hot war.
There you go.
Hey,
Yeah.
Just like the beginning, I set it up.
Uh-huh.
She knocked it down. It was all a plan. Feel the that'll be the title of the China Uncensored book, The Condensation of the Cold War to Hot War, something like that.
Yeah,
It'll
that's
sell 1 million
snappy
copies.
title.
I'll get JD Vance to write the foreword.
It's got us sweating, right?
Certainly got me sweating.
Yep. One last thing, if I may.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, last thing, because this to me kind of encapsulates how it's easy to misunderstand India. The Indian foreign policy, you'll often hear them say the world is one family, right? And it sounds very blithe and kind of glib, But I think if you're from a place like India, where extended families are so important, you know how complicated and messy families actually are. And so it's not what a world is one family means is you're stuck with who you're stuck with, and you have to try to make it work. Right, you've got the brother who's going to come in and steal your stuff, and the uncle who makes the inappropriate jokes and whatever. But it's your family, and you have to make it work. So the idea that you're just in the context of condescension or condensation, that if you when you're hearing assessments or analyses or turns of phrases that are coming out of India, it's very quick to think you actually understand what's going on. But often it's actually more simple, but also has more complexity to it and more nuance to it than you might think, because they live in such a complex environment. So when you get this information, like, for example, the Economist article that says, oh, well, they do trade with China, so, they're stuck with China. That blitheness that probably doesn't, but we think makes sense in our own context, probably doesn't make sense in an Indian context. So if they are at a BRICS meeting, or if they're dealing with the Iranians, or if they're dealing with the Russians, you can't superimpose our paradigms and our operating environment on why they're doing it. And it behooves you to try to understand a little bit more of the complexity. You could still think that they're wrong to do it, but don't assume you understand why they're doing it without going to some of the Indian sources that are discussing it. And there's a lot of kind of very entertaining, Jerry Springer-esque, political shows you can see on YouTube that discuss some of these issues from Indian TV. That will give you a sense of what's actually going on if you can stand 5 different Indian military leaders and politicians talking at the same time. It's very interesting, and you'll learn a lot, and it might put us in a better position to be able to defend ourselves as this kind of wave of geopolitical change goes back and forth across the landscape.
Well, watching Jerry Springer is how I learned about America. So I'd better watch some of those Indian shows.
Yeah, I'd recommend it. It's you'll learn. I learn a lot every time I watch it. I learn a lot, and again, it's if you get 5 Indians on a talk show, you'll get at least 6 different opinions. So it's not about agreeing; it's about just understanding all of these different pieces of information and nuances that help you realize there may be a totally different reason that they're at a BRICS meeting or at an SCO meeting than what you assumed. And you're not going to get it from The Economist.
Good thing they're paywalled, so we can't read them anyway. Well, thank you for joining us once again, Cleo. I think you're everyone's favorite guest.
Oh, thank you. Not in person, I have to say. So I enjoy the virtual environment. When I go in person, they're like, lock the fridge and keep her away from the breakables.
Our audience is saying that we should lock the fridge.
I think she means if she's like a guest in your home.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm the perfect virtual guest.
Yeah.
I got you.
Yeah. It's a double meaning of guest. So.
A double entendre.
Yes, yes, yes.
Your Quebec background is showing finally.
Yes, as I said, I'm the Montreal of humor. Thank you for being here, Cleo.
Ça fait plaisir.
Always a pleasure to have Cleo back on, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. There's always so much to talk about that we didn't even run through all our questions.
Oh yeah, not even. There was so much more. If you'd like more, thank you for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chong.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
We'll talk to you next time. For money.